He came home to forget the war. But his dog remembered the men who never change. In a town that salutes soldiers by day and buries truth by night, one loyal companion will uncover what silence tried to hide. The rain had not stopped for days in the small town of Mayfield, Mississippi. The streets shimmered with the reflection of dull street lights, puddles swallowing the sound of passing trucks, and the scent of wet soil hung heavy in the air. It was on one of those gray evenings that Jacob Harlan returned home after the war, a man carrying medals in his bag, but ghosts in his mind. The Army had honored him. Newspapers had called him a hero. Yet when he stepped off the bus, there were no banners, no crowd, just silence and the faint echo of rain on tin roofs. Jacob walked through the town with Rex, his German shepherd, by his side. The dog's movements were sharp and disciplined, a shadow of the soldier he once followed through smoke and chaos. Every step Jacob took was measured, steady, as though the war had taught him that peace was never guaranteed. The townsfolk glanced at him from behind curtains, their eyes betraying something between curiosity and unease. Some nodded stiffly, others turned away. The air seemed to whisper he was back, but he wasn't one of them anymore. He rented a small, run-down house on the edge of town, next to a row of rusting fences and half-broken porches. The neighbors were polite, but distant. At the gas station where Jacob found work, conversations would fall silent when he entered. The men there liked to talk about the war, but not to someone who had lived it. The local sheriff, Earl Donnelly, would stop by often, exchanging shallow words wrapped in authority. Beneath that measured smile, Jacob sensed something colder, a quiet hostility that came not from the uniform, but from the man wearing it. Rex felt it too. The dog's instincts were still alive, still sharp. Every time Donnelly approached, Rex's body stiffened, his gaze fixed, his breath slow but deliberate. The sheriff laughed it off, saying, "You sure he remembers which side he's on?" But Jacob caught the bitterness in his tone. There was history buried somewhere between them, something neither man spoke of but both felt. Days turned into weeks. Jacob's life settled into routine. Work, home, quiet dinners, and long walks with Rex under fading skies. The only break in that silence came when Malcolm, a 12-year-old black boy from down the road, started visiting. The boy had a natural curiosity. Unafraid of Jacob's war stories or Rex's imposing size, he would bring old baseballs and ask Jacob to throw them, laughing when Rex chased them down with perfect precision. Jacob saw in the boy what the world often took away too early, innocence untouched by hate. But not everyone saw it that way. The town's whispers grew louder. Some said Jacob was forgetting his place. Others claimed he was corrupting the boy with his war stories. The same men who praised soldiers on the 4th of July couldn't stand seeing one share a table with a black child. Jacob tried to ignore them. He had seen worse. Real hate, real division, and he told himself that peace was about choosing not to fight. Rex, however, didn't share that calm. He began reacting differently, barking at certain townsmen, growling whenever Sheriff Donnelly's truck slowed by the corner. At first, Jacob scolded him softly, thinking the war had made the dog too protective. But sometimes, late at night, he would look into Rex's eyes and see not aggression, but warning, as if the animal understood the world far better than the man beside him. Then came the first real sign that the town had changed toward him. The customers at the gas station thinned. His boss began asking him to take a few days off. A stranger spit near his boots while passing him on the street, muttering something Jacob didn't care to hear. It wasn't open hostility, not yet, but it was the kind that grew quietly, spreading like rust through a forgotten machine. Still, Jacob kept his head down. He told himself he fought enough battles overseas and didn't need to start another one here. Yet every time Malcolm waved from across the road, Jacob saw the looks people gave the boy, not of disapproval, but of warning. He wanted to tell Malcolm to stay away, protect him from what he knew was coming. But each time, he stopped himself. Maybe this was his second chance, not to fight, but to stand for something. The rain returned one night, heavier than before. Jacob sat on the porch, sipping cold coffee, listening to the steady hum of water against the roof. Rex lay near his feet, ears perked, eyes trained on the road. The night felt too still, a silence that didn't belong. Jacob's thoughts drifted towards sleep until Rex's low growl broke the quiet. The dog stood, hackles raised, eyes locked on something beyond the fence. Jacob followed his gaze and froze. At the end of the driveway, a truck sat in the dark, headlights off, engine running. The rain shimmered on its hood, the shape barely visible, but the outline of a man inside was clear. Sheriff Donnelly's hat caught the faint light of a passing car. He didn't move, didn't step out, just sat there, watching. Jacob's pulse steadied, his hand brushing Rex's head. The dog's body trembled with restrained energy, muscles tense, waiting for a command that never came. The rain fell harder, the engine idled, and for a long, breathless moment, no one moved. Then the truck shifted into gear, taillights glowing red before vanishing into the mist. Rex didn't sit down. He just stared into the distance, chest rising and falling, as if he knew something Jacob didn't, that the war wasn't over. It had only changed its battlefield. Rex growls again, this time softer, his eyes following the direction where the truck disappeared. And Jacob realizes the dog hasn't just remembered the war. He's remembered the enemy. The nights in Mayfield had begun to stretch longer, heavy with silence that clung to the walls of Jacob's small home. Sleep no longer came easy. When it did, it arrived in flashes, bursts of noise, faces of men he once led, the echo of gunfire that seemed to follow him across the ocean. He often woke gasping for air, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling as though it were the endless night sky of another country. Rex would always be beside him, eyes open, waiting, his head resting near Jacob's arm. The dog seemed to know the rhythm of his nightmares. When Jacob's breathing quickened, Rex would nudge his hand, grounding him back into the quiet of home. The house was small, but even its stillness wasn't safe. Every sound outside, a passing car, a door creaking next door, the low hum of wind through the trees, would make Rex rise suddenly. His instincts had never faded. They were as sharp as the day he followed Jacob through battlefields of smoke and confusion. Sometimes, the two seemed caught in a loop of memory, reacting not to what was there, but to what once was. The war had ended on paper, but in Jacob's mind it played endlessly, a reel that refused to stop. At the urging of Ruth, Jacob began attending a small veterans support group that met once a week at the community hall. That's where he met Dr. Eliza Ward, a calm but direct psychologist who specialized in helping soldiers rebuild their sense of belonging. She spoke softly, but never pityingly, a quality Jacob appreciated. In her sessions, she encouraged the men to talk about what they saw, what they lost, and what they still carried inside them. Jacob rarely spoke, but he listened. He found something comforting in Eliza's patience, the way she believed that healing didn't mean forgetting. She told him that trauma wasn't the enemy, denial was. Outside those meetings, however, the world didn't share her compassion. Sheriff Donnelly had begun spreading quiet rumors about Jacob and his war dog. He told anyone who would listen that Rex wasn't stable, that Jacob was dangerous when cornered. To a town already trained to fear what it didn't understand, those words stuck like thorns. People who once nodded at Jacob stopped coming to the gas station. His boss began scheduling fewer shifts, murmuring excuses about slow business. It wasn't open hostility yet, but it was isolation disguised as politeness. Jacob didn't respond. He had learned that silence often spoke louder than argument, but he noticed the change in the way people looked at Rex, no longer as a loyal companion, but as a symbol of something they couldn't control. To them, the dog wasn't a veteran's friend. He was an extension of Jacob's unsettled mind. Every time Rex barked at a stranger, it added weight to the lies being whispered. The only time Jacob felt peace was when Malcolm stopped by after school. The boy still came, unafraid, asking endless questions about the war. Not the fighting, but the courage, the sacrifice, the meaning behind it. Jacob answered carefully, avoiding the parts that left scars. Sometimes they'd sit in silence, throwing sticks for Rex near the riverbank, while the evening sun turned the water to gold. In those quiet moments, Jacob began to believe that maybe the past didn't have to define him. Maybe loyalty and kindness could rebuild what war had broken. But peace, he'd learned, was fragile. One afternoon, he heard shouting from the town square while refueling cars. When he looked up, he saw Malcolm surrounded by a few older boys near the general store. One of them accused him of stealing candy. his tone sharp, his voice loud enough for onlookers to gather. Jacob's heart sank. He recognized the faces, the sons of men who used to serve under Sheriff Donnelly. Without thinking, Jacob stepped forward, his calm but firm presence cutting through the noise. He told them the boy hadn't taken anything, that they should check before they judged. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of someone used to giving orders that meant life or death. The crowd went still. The store owner, uncomfortable under the attention, quickly waved it off, muttering that it was probably a misunderstanding. But the damage was done. In the eyes of those watching, Jacob had picked a side, not just in a petty argument, but in a line that the town had drawn long ago. That evening, Sheriff Donnelly stopped by the gas station. His truck door slammed harder than it needed to, his boots echoing against the concrete. He leaned against the counter, smiling without warmth. "Heard you've been playing hero again," he said, his voice low but deliberate. "You might want to remember which folks keep this town running." Jacob met his gaze calmly, saying nothing. Rex stood beside him, alert, eyes locked on the sheriff. Donnelly smirked. "You keep that dog on a leash, Harlan. Be a shame if someone thought he was a threat." Then he left, the sound of his tires grinding gravel into dust. That night, the air felt heavier than usual. The sky was overcast, no stars to cut through the darkness. Jacob sat by the window, unable to shake the feeling that something was shifting around him, unseen but closing in. Rex wouldn't settle. He moved from room to room, sniffing near the windows, pausing every few minutes to stare out toward the yard. Near midnight, a faint crackling sound drew Jacob's attention. He stepped onto the porch, the cold night air biting at his skin. The smell hit him first. Smoke, faint but unmistakable. At the edge of the fence, something flickered. His breath caught as he saw it, a small wooden cross half burned, still smoldering in the dirt. Rex began digging near the fence, his paws frantic, until they struck something soft. When Jacob knelt to look, his stomach tightened. A torn piece of cloth, stained, damp, and red, lay half buried beneath the soil. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill deeper than any battlefield memory ever had. The town's quiet war had finally reached his doorstep, and this time it wasn't one he could leave behind. Jacob stared at the smoking cross, the faint scent of gasoline still in the air, while Rex stood guard beside him, silent, unblinking, waiting for what was coming next. By morning, what had happened at the general store was no longer a small misunderstanding. It was a story retold in kitchens, barbershops, and church porches, each version bending a little more than the last. Some said Jacob had snapped. Others said he had turned on his own. A few, in hushed tones, said he had done what no one else had the courage to do: stand up for a black child in a town that preferred to look the other way. In Mayfield, truth didn't travel as fast as opinion, and opinions were owned by those who spoke the loudest. Sheriff Donnelly was one of them. Jacob felt the shift the moment he stepped into town that day. People who used to greet him with stiff nods now pretended to be occupied. Women pulled their children closer when Rex walked by, even though the dog was leashed and calm. At the gas station, 2 regulars turned their trucks around when they saw Jacob behind the counter. No one confronted him directly, but the message was clear. He had crossed an invisible line. He hadn't just defended Malcolm. He had challenged the town's unspoken order. That afternoon, Malcolm's mother, Ruth, came to see him. She was a quiet woman, strong in the way nurses often are, used to long hours and hard truths. She thanked Jacob for protecting her son, her eyes full of gratitude, but also worry. She told him, without dramatics, that Mayfield had always operated under a layered system. Some families got second chances, some got warnings, some got watched. Sheriff Donnelly, she said, didn't just enforce the law. He decided who the law applied to. Jacob listened, jaw tight. He had fought in a foreign land believing America was worth defending. And yet here, in this small town, fairness was still something men rationed out like supplies. Ruth's visits became more frequent after that. She would bring over food, check on Jacob's hand when it shook, and sometimes sit on the porch, talking about Malcolm's dreams of leaving town one day. Rex took to her quickly. The dog started wandering toward Ruth's house in the evenings, circling the yard, sniffing the fence, returning to Jacob only after making sure the place was safe. Jacob noticed it and didn't stop him. If Rex sensed danger around Ruth's family, there was probably a reason. When Jacob mentioned it to Eliza during their next meeting, she didn't dismiss it as mere canine habit. She explained that loyalty in trained dogs, especially war dogs, was tied to memory and environment. If Rex was beginning to patrol again, it was because he recognized rising threat patterns, the same way he did overseas. She looked at Jacob with a seriousness that made him sit straighter. Trauma, she said, didn't always come as fear. Sometimes it came as overprotection. Sometimes it came as readiness. Rex might be reliving the war not because he was broken, but because the environment around him was starting to resemble the tension of a battlefield. Watched faces, quiet threats, division. Jacob didn't want Rex to become the town's excuse. He had already heard whispers that the sheriff was telling people the dog was unpredictable, a danger to folks who didn't mean harm. So Jacob made a decision. He began retraining Rex in the yard during the late afternoons, not for attack, but for stillness. He worked on commands that calmed, not escalated. He practiced recall, sit, heel, and stay with more precision than ever. He spoke to Rex the way he had in the desert, calm but authoritative, reminding the dog that he was safe, that this wasn't war. Several times, as he gave a command, he caught neighbors watching from a distance, their eyes narrowing, as if even discipline looked threatening in his hands. Despite his efforts, the town's mood kept souring. At the diner, Jacob overheard two men say, "War broke him. Should have stayed gone." Another man replied, "And that dog, that's not a pet. That's a weapon." It stung, not because they were strangers, but because some of them had once praised him for serving. Now, because he refused to let a black child be humiliated, his service had become a flaw instead of an honor. One evening, Ruth came by in a hurry, eyes alert. Someone had followed her from the clinic, she said. A truck had slowed behind her for too long, then turned away when she reached Jacob's road. Jacob walked her back home, Rex leading, ears pricked. The tension was no longer theoretical. It was moving, watching, circling. That night, without being told, Rex lay down in Ruth's yard, positioning himself where he could see the road. His presence alone seemed to push the darkness back a few feet. But even Jacob couldn't predict what happened next. The following night, around sundown, he realized Rex wasn't in the house. At first, he assumed the dog had gone on one of his perimeter checks like he sometimes did, but as the minutes became an hour, Jacob felt a knot tighten in his chest. He whistled in the yard. No answer. He checked Ruth's home. She hadn't seen him. The sky darkened, and with it came a familiar, unwelcome feeling, the sense of losing control of the ground beneath him. Rex returned close to midnight. Jacob heard him before he saw him. The soft padding of paws on wet earth, the faint huff of breath. The dog was not injured, but his paws were muddy, and there were small splinters clinging to the fur on his legs, as though he had pushed through wood or fencing. His eyes were alert, not fearful, and he went straight to Jacob, sitting down as if reporting back. Jacob inspected him, confused but relieved. He washed the mud from Rex's paws, noting the dirt was darker than the soil near his own property. The explanation came at dawn. When the town woke up, word spread faster than the sun. The sheriff's office sign, the one that stood like a symbol of authority in front of the building, had been scratched, splintered, and torn in long, deliberate marks. Not destruction, but a clear warning. Someone had wanted to send a message without harming anyone. The rumor turned quickly toward Jacob, toward his dog, toward the war animal he refused to get rid of. Sheriff Donnelly stood in front of the damaged sign, jaw clenched, eyes cold. Men gathered around him, waiting for his response. Some amused, some eager. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He spoke in a low, controlled voice that carried across the square. He said a town couldn't tolerate an unstable animal. He said a man who couldn't control his dog couldn't be trusted. Then, looking straight in the direction of Jacob Street, he said he would put down that dog, legally or otherwise. The morning air carried a tension that was almost visible, like heat rising off asphalt. The town bulletin board outside the post office bore a new notice, a community meeting called by Sheriff Earl Donnelly to address ongoing public safety concerns. Everyone knew what that meant. In Mayfield, nothing was ever said directly, meaning lived between the lines. Jacob saw the notice on his way to the gas station and felt a slow tightening in his chest. Beside him, Rex sniffed the ground, unbothered by the unease that now shadowed every corner of town life. By evening, the town hall was full, the kind of full reserved for gossip, spectacle, or tragedy. Rows of wooden chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted for better views. The smell of old varnish mixed with humidity and sweat. Men leaned forward with crossed arms. Women whispered behind handkerchiefs. And near the front, Sheriff Donnelly stood with a paper folded in his hand, expression calm, voice controlled. Behind him hung the faded American flag that once made Jacob proud. Tonight, it felt like a stage prop. The sheriff began by calling for civility. He spoke about the recent disturbances, about how certain behaviors were unsettling the peace. His words were measured, every phrase dressed in politeness but sharpened underneath. Then he said the name, Jacob Harlan. A murmur moved through the room like wind through dry grass. He claimed that Jacob's dog, Rex, was unstable, dangerous, a risk to the townspeople, and especially their children. He cited the damaged sign at his office as evidence of uncontrolled behavior. He never said accusation, never said guilt, but everyone heard it all the same. Jacob stood slowly, his voice even but low. He didn't try to charm or defend. He simply told the truth. He explained that Rex was a service dog, trained in discipline and loyalty, not aggression. He held up the military papers and a photograph of Rex in uniform beside soldiers overseas. He spoke of the lives the dog had saved, the medals they had earned together, the years of quiet companionship that followed. There was no arrogance in his tone, only the steady dignity of a man who had already faced worse than this. But Donnelly wasn't interested in truth. He smiled thinly and said, "Even soldiers make mistakes." The words landed heavy. It wasn't about the dog anymore. It was about Jacob, the returning veteran, who had stepped outside the boundaries of what the town thought was acceptable. Some nodded at the sheriff's remark, others looked away, unsure. The line between law and bias blurred as easily as ink in water. Then Ruth stood. Her voice cut through the murmurs, calm but unwavering. She said the sheriff's accusations were baseless, that Jacob had done nothing but defend her son when others wouldn't. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness to fairness. But in that moment, her courage cost her. The crowd turned, whispers, turning sharp. To them, a black woman speaking against the sheriff wasn't just defiance. It was betrayal of an order they'd silently agreed to keep. Eliza sat near the back, a small recorder hidden in her purse. She had anticipated something like this. Her training as a psychologist told her that fear had a pattern. It repeated itself through people who didn't want to see it. As she watched, she noted every phrase, every reaction, every veiled prejudice disguised as concern for safety. She wasn't there to intervene. She was there to remember. The tension in the hall built like an approaching storm. One man shouted that the dog should be put down before someone gets hurt. Another muttered that Jacob had brought war home with him. Jacob remained silent, his eyes fixed on Donnelly, who seemed to feed off the crowd's rising energy. Words turned to noise, voices overlapping until it was impossible to tell who said what. Then suddenly, the sharp crash of glass shattered the air. A bottle had come through the side window, scattering shards across the floor. The hall erupted into movement, chairs scraping, people shouting, children crying. Rex barked once, then twice, loud and commanding. Instinct took over. The dog leapt toward Jacob, placing himself between his master and the chaos, his stance protective, but not wild. A deputy stumbled in the confusion, tripping over a chair, and Rex brushed past him, sending the man sprawling. It wasn't an attack. It was movement born of training, a soldier's reflex. But in that moment, perception replaced fact. Sheriff Donnelly's hand went to his holster, his eyes locking on the dog. For a heartbeat, everything froze. The sound, the air, the pulse of the room. The sheriff's fingers brushed the weapon's grip, but stopped there. He didn't draw. He didn't need to. The silence that followed carried its own verdict. When calm returned, the story had already taken shape in whispers and retellings. Veteran's dog attacks officer. It didn't matter that no one was hurt, that the chaos came from someone outside. The narrative was too convenient to resist. By the next morning, it was written as truth. The town paper printed the sheriff's statement, and by noon, Jacob and Rex were labeled a threat to public order. Jacob walked home in silence that evening. He didn't try to explain. Explanations never worked on people who didn't want to understand. Rex walked close beside him, tail low, eyes scanning every shadow. The street lamps flickered, as though even they were hesitant to stay lit. At home, Jacob sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the walls, trying to make sense of how easily respect had turned into fear. Then he heard the sound, paper sliding against wood. He looked toward the front door and saw an envelope that hadn't been there before. No address, no signature, just a folded sheet inside with a few words written in uneven ink. "They'll come for the dog first." Jacob read it twice, his heart steady but his mind spinning. He folded the note neatly, placed it beside the medal he no longer wore, and turned toward Rex, who was already awake, watching the door. The war hadn't followed him home after all. It had been waiting here the whole time, quiet, patient, and ready to begin again. Outside, a car engine started, its headlights flashing briefly across the window before disappearing into the dark, as if the night itself was keeping watch. The wind carried the smell of dust and smoke, an omen of change that settled over Jacob's small home like an unwelcome guest. The letter still sat on his table, its few words etched into his mind. He had read it again and again, hoping its threat would fade with repetition, but the weight of it only grew heavier. "They'll come for the dog first." It wasn't a warning, it was a promise. He moved quietly through the dim light, folding clothes, stacking a few old photos, and gathering the medals he once thought mattered. Rex followed each motion, eyes tracking every movement as if understanding that this wasn't an ordinary night. Jacob had lived through the noise of battle, but this kind of silence, the kind that presses against the skin, that feels like being watched, was something different. He tried to believe he could slip out unnoticed, that leaving might keep the peace. But deep down, he knew Mayfield wasn't built to let go of a grudge. Outside, the moon hung low and red over the horizon. The town seemed asleep, but the stillness was deceptive. From the open window came faint sound, voices carried by the wind, laughter that didn't belong to Joy. Jacob froze, then a soft knock on the door. He turned sharply before Rex's low growl confirmed what instinct had already told him. Someone was there. When he opened the door, Ruth stood under the porch light, her face drawn but steady. Behind her, Eliza held a camera bag, her eyes scanning the shadows before stepping inside. They had heard what was coming. Malcolm, Ruth said, had overheard two men near the diner talking about a plan to end this mess before sunrise. An ambush, they called it. "They said they'd make it look like an accident," Ruth whispered, her voice trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. "They're coming tonight." Eliza placed a hand on Jacob's arm. She told him running wouldn't change what the town already believed. "If you leave," she said, "they'll say it's because you were guilty. But if you face them, if people see the truth, it might stop something worse." Jacob looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. He had spent his life following orders, saving lives that sometimes didn't want saving. But tonight wasn't about war. It was about dignity, his and the dog's that had followed him through every shadow. He looked down at Rex, who stood by the door, tail stiff, muscles tight, eyes locked on the horizon. The dog had been restless all evening, pacing, pausing near the window, growling under his breath at the slightest sound. Jacob knelt and whispered something low, words only Rex could understand. The animal's breathing steadied, but the tension in his body didn't fade. He was ready. They didn't have to wait long. The first sign came as distant lights weaving through the dark trees, the unmistakable twin beams of a truck making its way up the dirt road. The rumble of tires over gravel grew louder, joined by others behind it. Jacob stepped out onto the porch, Ruth and Eliza close behind. The headlights stopped a few yards away, washing them in blinding white. When the engines cut off, silence filled the air again, thick, humming, alive. Sheriff Donnelly climbed out first, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Behind him stood a handful of men. Some Jacob recognized, others hidden behind the anonymity of darkness. Donnelly's hand rested on his belt, his posture casual, his tone almost friendly. "Evening, Harlan," he said. "Heard you're planning to leave. Thought we'd come wish you off." Jacob said nothing. The sheriff took a step closer, eyes catching the dim reflection of the porch light. "You could have just gone quiet, you know. Folks might have forgotten. But now," He tilted his head slightly toward Rex. "Now you've made it hard for them to feel safe." Eliza began recording, her camera barely visible in her hands. Ruth stood firm, her voice clear as she spoke into the night. "You don't scare us, Sheriff. Everyone knows what this is." The sheriff's smile faltered, replaced by a look of irritation. "Careful, ma'am," he said. "You don't want to make things worse for yourself." Rex growled, deep and controlled, the sound vibrating through the still air. The men behind Donnelly shifted uneasily. One of them muttered something about putting the dog down. Another gripped a flashlight tighter, its beam twitching across the ground like nervous energy. The tension was unbearable. So thick it seemed the night itself was holding its breath. Jacob finally spoke, his voice steady, stripped of emotion. "You came here for a fight, but I'm not giving you one." Donnelly smirked, but there was unease behind his confidence now. "You don't have to. The thing beside you might do it for you." For a few endless seconds, no one moved. Then a sound cut through the tension. A small rock, tossed carelessly from the back of the crowd, striking the dirt near the porch with a dull thud. It was a small act, but it broke the fragile balance holding the moment together. Rex reacted instantly, charging forward a few steps, bark sharp, echoing through the dark. The men jerked back, startled, hands raising defensively. But before chaos could take hold, Jacob's voice cut through the noise. "Rex, stay." The single command hung in the air like a verdict. The dog stopped mid-motion, muscles trembling, growl fading to silence. The crowd froze. That one act, pure control, pure trust, shifted something in the space between them. The men who had come expecting madness saw discipline instead. Some lowered their weapons. Even Donnelly hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he had just lost control of a script he thought he'd written. Eliza's camera light blinked faintly, recording every second. The night that had begun as an ambush was becoming evidence. No one spoke. No one dared to. Finally, Donnelly turned back toward his truck, muttering, "This isn't over." His voice carried the weight of something wounded, not triumphant. He motioned for his men to leave, and slowly, reluctantly, they followed. Engines roared to life one by one, headlights retreating into the dark until only silence remained. Jacob stood still long after they were gone, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Ruth exhaled shakily, Eliza lowering the camera. The quiet returned, heavier now but cleaner somehow, as if the air itself had changed. Rex leaned against Jacob's leg, his body still tense but his gaze calm. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a faint orange glow flickered against the night sky. The smell of smoke arrived a moment later, sharp and unmistakable. A second truck tore past on the main road, siren blaring faintly. Ruth turned, confusion flashing across her face. Eliza's hand flew to her mouth. Jacob looked toward the horizon where the glow brightened, spreading upward. He didn't need to ask what it was. He already knew. Behind the wheel of his truck, Sheriff Donnelly watched his barn burn against the night, while his deputy leaned in close and whispered, "Sir, someone just torched your barn." The night sky over Mayfield glowed an angry orange, the kind of light that didn't belong to street lamps or sunset. News of the sheriff's barn burning spread faster than wildfire itself. Within minutes, trucks rolled toward the Donnelly property. Neighbors grabbed buckets, and men shouted orders into the smoky dark. But through all the frantic movement, one detail threaded its way into the rumors. Jacob Harlan had just faced off with the sheriff that same night. To some, that was all the proof they needed. To others, it was too convenient to be real. Jacob, Ruth, Eliza, and Rex stood in Jacob's yard watching the distant glow. None of them moved toward the fire, not out of indifference, but because they knew that if they arrived, they wouldn't be seen as helpers. They would be seen as suspects. Eliza still held the camera she had used to record the standoff. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what she knew they now had. Evidence, real, undeniable, time-stamped proof that the sheriff had come to Jacob's home with men and intimidation. By morning, what she recorded was no longer just sitting in her bag. She made quiet copies. She passed one to the pastor's wife, another to a teacher, who had always been soft-spoken but fair, another to a clerk at the town office, who had once confided in her about Donnelly's temper. She didn't blast it out in public. She let it travel through the hands of those who still had a conscience. It spread in whispers, not broadcast, because in a town governed by pride, truth had to move like contraband. For the first time since Donnelly took office, people began to ask questions. Not loudly, not in front of him, but in corners. Why would the sheriff show up at a veteran's home at night with a group of men? Why was he so focused on a dog when real crime still went unreported? Why did the barn burn on the same night there had been a confrontation? The version of Donnelly as the calm protector of Mayfield began to crack. People didn't stop following him, not yet, but they stopped believing him without thinking. Sensing the shift, the mayor, a man who preferred things smooth and quiet, called for an emergency town meeting at the courthouse. He said it was to address public tension, but everyone knew it was really to control the narrative before it unraveled. The courthouse filled quickly, more than it usually did. This time, people didn't come just to watch. They came to listen and to measure. Sheriff Donnelly arrived late, his face hard, eyes red-rimmed from a night without sleep and from watching his barn turn to ash. When he stood to speak, he didn't bother with pleasantries. He went straight for Jacob. He accused him of retaliation, of escalating a simple disagreement into lawlessness. He even suggested that outside influences were stirring up racial agitation in town. His words were less controlled now, less polished. The mask he wore in public had slipped just enough to expose the bitterness beneath. Jacob stood when called upon. He simply stated where he had been, at home, and that Ruth and Eliza were there to confirm it. Ruth rose next, voice steady and clear, completely unshaken by the eyes fixed on her. She said she was with Jacob. She said the sheriff had come to Jacob's property, not the other way around. She said the fire started after the sheriff left. Malcolm, fidgeting beside her, added in his own small voice that he had been there too. In that moment, it wasn't just a veteran against a sheriff. It was a black family, a woman, a child, and an outsider psychologist standing together. That image did something to the room. Eliza asked to play a portion of the recording. The mayor hesitated, but the crowd wanted to hear it. The audio filled the courthouse. The sheriff's voice at night. The men with him. The dog barking once. Jacob's command stopping him. The sheriff's threat. The vehicles leaving. It was calm. It was factual. It was not the chaos Donnelly had described. The sheriff's jaw clenched. He tried to spin it. He said the recording was out of context. He said sometimes forceful presence was needed to keep order. But the more he talked, the more it sounded like he was trying to cover a mistake rather than lead a town. The mayor narrowed his eyes. A few townspeople shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with what they were seeing. Not a confident lawman, but a man whose authority was suddenly fragile. Then Donnelly made a mistake. He went personal. He turned to Jacob and said, "You've always had a problem with discipline, Harlan. Even back then, even in uniform." The room stilled. Jacob's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in recognition. Eliza looked between them. Ruth's face tightened. There was something in the sheriff's tone, something heavier than local politics, something old. Jacob said quietly, "You weren't in my unit." Donnelly didn't answer. His eyes flickered, and in that flicker the truth surfaced. Because Jacob's unit, the one he always spoke of with pride and sorrow, had been a mixed-race division, integrated, overlooked, sent where others didn't want to go. Jacob stared at him, putting pieces together. "You were assigned to support detail in 69, Jacob said slowly, as if pulling the memory from a fog. "There was a patrol left behind that day. Command said backup never arrived." Donnelly's face flushed. He tried to move on, but the room was watching now. Eliza's recorder was still on. He said, "That has nothing to do with this town." Jacob didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He said the simplest, sharpest thing he could. "You left them." A murmur rippled through the courthouse. The people there might not have known military protocol, but they knew what cowardice looked like. Donnelly's prejudice, his obsession with control, his resentment toward Jacob, it all began to make sense. He had abandoned a unit of black and white soldiers serving together, and Jacob had been part of the division that survived. Donnelly had spent years burying what that said about him, and now it was exposed. Rex, who had been lying at Jacob's feet, suddenly lifted his head, eyes locked on the sheriff, his ears flattened, a low rumble forming in his chest. It wasn't random. It was recognition. That voice, panicked, defensive, the same pitch it must have carried years ago, was one the dog remembered. To Rex, Donnelly wasn't just a local sheriff. He was a familiar presence from a moment of abandonment, a man who hadn't shown up. The sheriff stepped back, rattled now, and snapped, "Control that animal!" But his anger sounded thin. The courtroom no longer saw Jacob as a threat. They saw a man who had done his duty, and another man who hadn't. Before anything else could be said, a sharp sound cracked through the air. A gunshot. Close, inside the building. Lights flickered as people screamed and ducked. Papers flew. Benches scraped. Someone shouted for everyone to get down. The courthouse that had just tasted truth was thrown into chaos once more. The courthouse had never echoed like that before. The gunshot snapped through the room, and for a heartbeat everything dissolved into light, sound, and panic. People dropped behind benches. Papers flew. The mayor shouted for order, and someone screamed without knowing why. But when the echoes faded and the lights steadied, the scene that emerged was not one of war, not one of enemy lines or clashing sides. It was something quieter, messier, painfully human. Sheriff Earl Donnelly was on the floor, clutching his side, stunned more than broken, his eyes wide with the realization that the shot had not come from Jacob, nor from any imagined threat, but from his own deputy standing feet away, trembling, gun lowered, face pale. "I couldn't let you do it," the deputy said, voice cracking, eyes never lifting from his fallen superior. There was no triumph in it, no rebellion, only a heavy regret. He hadn't aimed to kill. He had aimed to stop. The deputy's action said what no one in town had dared to say aloud. The sheriff had crossed a line, and someone on the inside finally refused to follow. For a moment, no one moved toward Donnelly. He had been the man people feared, the man who had dictated whose voices mattered. Now he lay on the polished floor of the courthouse he had once ruled, groaning, hands pressed over the dark stain spreading beneath his shirt. People looked to each other for instruction, unsure whether to help. That uncertainty said everything about the town. Jacob didn't hesitate. He moved through the stunned crowd and knelt beside the very man who had tried to strip him of his dignity. His movements were calm and practiced, the way they had been on distant soil when a fellow soldier went down. War had taught him something this town hadn't. You don't leave people to bleed, even when you don't agree with them. He placed his hands over the wound, applying pressure, voice steady. "Stay with me," he said. Donnelly stared at him in disbelief, pain clouding his eyes, pride cracking. His breath came short. "You should have let me die," he muttered, words barely audible. It wasn't drama. It was confession. He had lived too long inside his own guilt and resentment. A public fall felt worse than death. Jacob didn't look up. "Then nothing would change," he replied quietly. That was the difference between them. Donnelly wanted escape. Jacob wanted resolution. Around them, the townspeople watched with an expression that was neither approval nor condemnation. It was shock at seeing mercy where revenge had been expected. Eliza, hands still shaking, lifted her camera again. She knew this was the moment that defined everything. Not the accusations, not the fire, not the late-night standoff, but this. A veteran holding pressure over the wound of the man who had tried to ruin him. Forgiveness not spoken in sermons, but demonstrated on a courthouse floor. Through her lens, she captured Jacob's focused expression, the sheriff's pained face. The crowd gathered in a circle, witnesses to a different kind of justice. Ruth stood with Malcolm at the back, both of them frozen. Malcolm tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Why is he helping him?" he whispered. Ruth looked at Jacob, then at her son. "Because that's what makes him different," she said softly. In towns like theirs, hate was easy, inherited, passed down like recipes and land. What Jacob did in that moment was unnatural to Mayfield's rhythm. That's why it mattered. Rex, who had been alert and tense throughout the chaos, moved closer. He did not bark. He did not bare his teeth. He simply sat beside Donnelly's shoulder, eyes watchful. The sheriff flinched at first, expecting the dog to lash out. But Rex remained still, breathing slow, gaze calm. For the first time, Donnelly saw the animal for what Jacob had been saying all along. Not a weapon, not a threat, but a protector responding to its master's heart. The image of the sheriff, the veteran, and the war dog together on the floor cut through the crowd's fear more than any speech would have. Paramedics were called. The mayor finally found his voice and began restoring order, telling people to clear a path. No one shouted accusations now. No one called for the dog to be taken. Something had shifted in the way people looked at Jacob. The footage Eliza had shared had planted doubt. This moment watered it. They couldn't unsee what they saw. The so-called danger to the town, saving the man who had tried to expel him from it. As Donnelly was lifted onto the stretcher, he grabbed Jacob's wrist weakly. His eyes were glossy, not just from pain, but from the weight of everything exposed. "You don't know what it's like to carry it," he rasped. Jacob met his gaze. Not angry, not warm either. "We all carry it," he said. "Some of us just don't make other people pay for it." Donnelly looked away, the truth landing harder than the wound. Outside, the early light was beginning to stretch over Mayfield. It wasn't full sunrise yet, just that pale blue hint of dawn that makes everything look softer, less threatening. People stepped out of the courthouse talking in low tones, not loud, not hateful. A few nodded to Jacob. Ruth walked beside him. Malcolm kept close to Rex, running his hand along the dog's back, no longer afraid someone would pull him away. Eliza stopped Jacob on the steps. "What you did in there," she said, "that's the thing they can't twist." Jacob shrugged slightly. "I didn't do it for them." Eliza gave a small smile. "Doesn't matter. They needed to see it." That morning the town wasn't transformed. Mayfield was too old in its ways to change in an instant. But something loosened. A few of the men who had once repeated the sheriff's words to their families now sat on their porches, thinking. The deputy who had fired the shot turned himself in willingly, telling anyone who asked that he had done it to stop something worse. The mayor, for the first time, looked like a man who would have to choose between comfort and truth. Jacob returned home with Rex trotting beside him. The sky was brighter now, streaked with light. On his porch sat an envelope, official-looking, unlike the ominous one from nights before. He picked it up, tore it open, and read in silence. "Your service is recognized. You are being called to testify before Congress." He stood there for a long moment, the letter in his hand, the town waking slowly behind him. It wasn't just about war anymore. Someone, somewhere beyond Mayfield, wanted to hear what he had to say about service, about reintegration, about the way some battles followed soldiers home and how others were created by the very towns they returned to. Rex nudged his leg as if asking what came next. Jacob looked out toward the road, dawn spilling across it, and knew this wasn't the end. It was the part of the story where truth finally had a place to go. Months had passed since that long night in Mayfield. The courthouse, once filled with shouting and suspicion, now stood quiet again. People went back to their routines, but something subtle had shifted beneath the town's surface. The story of what happened didn't vanish. It traveled quietly, like a truth that refused to stay buried. Eliza's footage, edited and sent through veteran networks and local news, began to spread beyond the borders of Mississippi. For the first time, Mayfield wasn't just a forgotten dot on a map. It had become a mirror reflecting what the country tried not to see. Jacob Harlan had not sought attention. He hadn't asked to be a symbol. But when the Department of Veterans Affairs reached out with a letter calling him to testify about racial discrimination among veterans and local power systems, he knew it wasn't about him alone. He had carried silence long enough, and so had others. Now he would speak, not to settle scores, but to honor those who couldn't. The hearing took place in Washington. The city felt larger than memory, the buildings cold but purposeful. Cameras lined the back of the room, flashes occasionally puncturing the otherwise somber air. Jacob sat at the table in a plain gray suit, no medals, no ribbons, just Rex beside him, calm and poised, his thick fur glinting under the overhead lights. The committee members whispered among themselves when they noticed the dog, but Jacob had been granted permission. "He's not just my partner," Jacob had said. "He's my witness." When he spoke, his words were slow, steady, measured by experience rather than anger. He spoke about service, not just on battlefields abroad, but in the battles soldiers faced coming home. He told them about towns that decorated veterans for courage, yet distrusted them for compassion. He spoke of racism not as politics, but as a scar that kept reopening in every generation, disguised as policy, as gossip, as silence. And he spoke about loyalty, the kind that survived when all else broke down. Eliza's recordings were entered into evidence. The footage showed truth without dramatics, a sheriff's threats, a dog's obedience, a man's restraint. It revealed the quiet war that small towns waged behind polite smiles. When the clip ended, no one spoke for several seconds. In that silence, Jacob felt something he hadn't in years, a sense that his words had weight again. He didn't know if laws would change, but people were listening, and sometimes that was the first victory. Rex sat close to Jacob's leg throughout the testimony, head high, eyes calm. He didn't fidget or react to the murmurs or the cameras. He was still the soldier's dog, dignified in every gesture. When Jacob finished speaking, Rex stood as if on cue, tail still, posture alert. The embodiment of loyalty turned into grace. The chairman, a decorated veteran himself, nodded once and said, "Thank you for your service and for reminding us what it means." Back in Mayfield, Ruth and Malcolm's lives had changed too. They had moved to a new neighborhood on the edge of town. It wasn't perfect. Some stairs still lingered, some doors still stayed closed. But there were also kind gestures, conversations that would never have happened before. Malcolm attended a new school, where his last name didn't define him. Sometimes, when he walked home, he would stop by the old gas station, where the paint had faded and Jacob's tools still hung on the wall, untouched. He would pet Rex, now older and slower, and tell him about his dreams of becoming a teacher. Rex listened the same way he always had, with complete attention, as if every word mattered. Sheriff Donnelly, meanwhile, resigned quietly. There was no ceremony, no farewell. He left his badge on the desk and disappeared to the outskirts of town. Some said he drank alone. Others said he tended a small patch of land where no one visited. The truth was simpler. He lived in the silence he had built for others, and in that silence, his own guilt became the only companion left. One late afternoon, Jacob drove out to the Veterans Cemetery, just outside of town. The road was lined with trees that had started shedding their leaves early, the air cool, tinged with the smell of distant rain. Rex sat in the passenger seat, head resting on the window frame, eyes half closed but alert. When they reached the hill, Jacob stepped out slowly, the crunch of gravel beneath his boots the only sound. The rows of white markers stretched endlessly, a quiet sea of names. He walked until he found the one he came for, a fellow soldier from his unit, one of the men who hadn't made it home. Jacob knelt, his knees pressing into the damp earth, and placed a small tarnished medal on the ground. It wasn't about honor or heroism anymore. It was about memory. Rex stood beside him, lowering his head until his muzzle nearly touched, the name carved into stone. For a moment the world felt still. Two veterans, man and animal, standing in the company of ghosts they both remembered. Jacob stayed there for a while, thinking about the war, about Mayfield, about how loyalty had outlived hate more times than he could count. As the wind picked up, he spoke softly, more to himself than anyone. Maybe dogs remember because they never learned to hate. The words hung in the air, neither bitter nor triumphant, just true. When he finally rose, the sun had begun to set. The sky burned orange and pink, the same colors that had once lit a burning barn, but now carried warmth instead of fear. He turned toward the truck, Rex following, limping slightly on an old injury, but walking with the same steady pride. At the crest of the hill, Jacob paused. Rex stopped beside him and looked back toward the field of flags, fluttering gently in the evening wind. One flag caught the light differently than the others, half-shadowed, half-lit. Jacob watched it for a long time, the image etching itself into his mind like a final message. As Jacob began walking down the slope, Rex lingered, eyes fixed on the flag. The wind shifted, and for just a second, it seemed to bow toward him, as if memory itself was acknowledging what only loyalty could truly remember. If this story made you feel something about loyalty, truth, or the battles we fight in silence, then share it with someone who still believes goodness can outlast hate. Don't just watch. Be part of the change. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to stand firm, even when the world turns away. Before you go, tell me this. If you were Jacob, would you forgive the town or walk away forever?